Good morning, everyone. I'll just give everybody a few more minutes to log on. It looks like we have most everybody.
Good morning, Dr. Hill.
Hi, Stephen. All right. So today we get another short lecture. I'm trying to sweeten you up with short lectures because next week the lectures will not be short. But I always try to make the deterrence lectures not quite as long because I know the week after that is when we start talking about prison and prison programs, which not only are kind of the focus of this class, but also my area of expertise. So that lecture is very long. So we're just going to kind of take it easy this week. So we're going to finish up. Stephen, will you pop your mic off? So we're going to finish up this lecture. We just have 2 slides to cover, but they're pretty hefty slides. We're going to go over what the research has said about deterrence, and also specifically sanctions. So for instance, if you must use deterrence theory, how do we make a sanction actually deter people based on what the research says? Spoiler alert, it doesn't work super well, but there are a few things that you can do according to the research. So as we start going through the research, we're also going to practice policy implications. So turning research findings into policy implications, because starting with today's quiz, the 5th question for the rest of your quizzes starting today will always be name a policy implication from that we covered this week. So you're going to have to take one of the research findings that we go over this week and turn it into a policy implication, and the same thing each week moving forward. That is also one of the big parts of your policy brief. So we're going to be practicing this all semester. All right, do we have any questions before we begin? We good? All right. Okay. Can we all see the lecture? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, very good. All right, so let's just do a quick overview before we get right into it. So we started by talking about the classical school of criminology, which deterrence theory was born from this. And this has the assumptions that human beings are rational, calculating, and hedonistic beings. And that we have to understand that crime is a product of free will and rational deliberation. We talked about Cesar Beccaриa's contribution, and specifically the series of reforms that he proposed became the foundation of deterrence theory, in that the system of punishment that is swift, certain, and proportionately severe, that's what we want to focus on. Then we talked about the basics of deterrence theory. Again, certain, swift, proportionately severe. Those should be the 3 words that pop into your head anytime you hear deterrence theory. And again, this theory has to be based on the assumption that humans are rational, self-interested beings. If not, they're not gonna respond to policies based on us that are certain, swift, and proportionately severe. We did our first policy implication here, which says that if criminal behavior is met with those 3 tenets, then it's going to tilt the balance away from criminal behavior towards pro-social behavior. Then we talked about general versus specific deterrence. Just as a reminder, general deterrence says that if you see someone being punished, then you're not going to commit that crime because you don't want that punishment. Whereas specific deterrence says that if you are punished yourself, then you're not going to commit that crime because you don't want that punishment again. Then we went through Stafford and Moore's 4 experiences with punishment. So personal experience with punishment. Who can give me an example of a personal experience with punishment? Stephen? Your mic's not on.
Okay, this is more so me being disciplined by my own parents, but it will still count. I was spanked for almost burning down my house.
Okay. I'll
It was
take that.
it wasn't
I was hoping
deliberate.
more for like a formal sanction, like receiving a speeding ticket.
Oh, I've
Um,
received punishments here. Do those count?
yes, that would be a personal experience with punishment.
Okay,
Um,
marching AD tours.
yes, there we go. So the next one that Stafford and Moore were talking about was a personal experience with punishment avoidance. So that means you commit a crime and you don't get punished. Vicarious experience with punishment, you see your friend commit a crime, they get punished. Vicarious experience with punishment avoidance, you see your friend commit a crime, they avoid punishment. Paternoster and Picaro tested that theory. They found that, in fact, Stafford and Moore were onto something. But the one weird thing that they found was that specific deterrence increases illegal behavior. So basically, when you commit a crime and you get punished, you continue to commit those crimes. They chalk that up to perhaps defiance theory, labeling theory, and we're also thinking it might just be the fact that they were talking to high schoolers who are prone to defiance. Then we talked about some flaws in the deterrence doctrine. The first is the normative consensus differences. So meaning we don't all agree that something that's against the law is bad, meaning it takes a different level of punishment to get us to stop doing those behaviors. But also not everybody is equally deterred by the same punishment. So a $100 fine isn't a big deal to a millionaire, whereas somebody living paycheck to paycheck, that's something that is very severe to them. Or conversely, somebody that spent 5 years in prison isn't really deterred by the threat of a month of incarceration, whereas most of us would be deterred by the threat of being incarcerated for a month. Another flaw of the deterrence doctrine is this economic conceptualization, meaning that the way the deterrence theory works, if we double the severity of a punishment, it should lead to double the number of people that aren't going to commit the crime. And it just doesn't work that way because most people have sort of a threshold. We're actually going to talk about another reason today why this economic conceptualization doesn't work super well in practice. All right, so that was a super quick overview of what we talked about on Tuesday. So let's start with the empirical research on deterrence, and we're going to go through one policy implication from this slide, and then the next slide has about 4 policy implications that we can practice. So I have broken down about 50 years of deterrence research into 2 slides. So I'm just giving you the super basics, but just know that there are thousands of studies on this, so we know pretty well how this works. So in general, most research has shown that policies that are based on deterrence have a very weak effect, meaning you implement a policy that is based on increasing the certainty, the severity, and the swiftness of punishment, it doesn't seem to have a very strong effect. So we know that for a fact based on about 50 years of research. So there's a couple of reasons why we think deterrence theory has such a weak effect. So we're going to go through a few of them. So the first is what we refer to as a tipping effect. So it's suggested that at low levels of certainty and severity, the punishment just hasn't reached that tipping point where it becomes a credible threat, right? So for instance, sanctions can only deter when they cross a certain threshold of credibility and become meaningful to those who contemplate offending, right? So if we have a punishment that results in basically what you would consider to be a slap on the wrist, that severity isn't strong enough to actually be a deterrent because you're not afraid of the punishment, right? So for instance, if speeding on campus was a $5 ticket, like nobody would obey the speed limit because that's not a very credible threat. The severity is really low. The other thing to consider is if the certainty is really low, people aren't going to obey that particular law because it's not a threat to them. So a perfect example, I went to USC for my undergraduate degree, And one of my professors was a former police officer, and he still was in close contact with a lot of the cops that worked in that area. And he told our class that the City of Columbia Police Department, as well as SLED, did not have the manpower or the funding to run radar on a specific road. If anybody in Columbia is familiar with Interstate 277 that goes from 77 directly into downtown Columbia, it was that particular road. And that was the road that I took in and out when I was leaving and coming back to campus going home. So he told us that they didn't have enough funding to be able to, hold on, James, to be able to run radar on that. So for that, to me, the certainty of getting caught was super low. So I literally never went the speed limit on that road because it hadn't reached the tipping point of being able to be a credible threat. James, what's up?
Do you know if that's still true? Because I live in Columbia and I just want to travel faster.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm not in touch with that professor anymore, and I went to college a very long time ago. Like, I graduated in 2006, so I don't know that I would still go by that. I've been through Columbia. I've been on that road several times, and I've never seen a cop. But again, I don't know how much faith you want to put in that, but you can just keep a running tally every time you go through there and let me know if you see a cop. But
yes, ma'am.
In the early 2000s, I could tell you that they didn't have the funding for that. I don't know about now, though. So that's a perfect example of the tipping point. The credibility was so low because I knew that the certainty of me getting caught was slim to none. So the speed limit was not a deterrent for me at all. All right, so that's the tipping effect. That explains why, that's one reason why we think deterrence theory doesn't work super well. Another thing that we consider is something called stigma erosion. So what we're talking about here, a stigma means that it's something bad, right? So if something is stigmatizing, that is bad. If something has a stigma to it, it indicates that this is something that's bad. So if we think of the word stigma erosion, what we're saying here is the stigmatizing effect, the thing that makes it bad might start well, it might work at first, but it's eroded and it doesn't work in the long term. So some policies may be effective in the short term, but they aren't effective in the long term. So one of the ways that this happens is that if in order for something to be stigmatizing, it has to be relatively uncommon, right? So when this happens to you, you're not, 1 in a million, you're, 1 in 5 that this has happened to, right? So if something is, so for instance, here's a perfect example. If I asked you to admit if you've had a speeding ticket, most people would readily admit that and not be ashamed to admit that, right? Because almost everyone's had a speeding ticket. It's not that stigmatizing to have a speeding ticket. However, if I asked you to admit if you've ever been arrested for a sex offense, that's not relatively common. People don't want to admit that. There's still a stigma to admitting that. So that being put on a sex offender registry, that is much more stigmatizing than getting a speeding ticket, because a speeding ticket is extremely common, whereas being placed on a sex offender registry is not very common and quite stigmatizing. So the reason it's stigma erosion is that we implement this policy, it's stigmatizing because not a lot of people have it. And then if all of a sudden, all these people start getting this punishment, all of a sudden it's not stigmatizing because everybody's experienced this. So that's what we refer to as stigma erosion, that once this becomes more popular, the foundation of the deterrent effect, the stigmatizing effect, is eroded. Everybody has it. We're not deterred by it because it's not a stigma anymore. So the next thing that we need to talk about with stigma erosion is something that we call stigma saturation. So if you think about it, sometimes certain segments of the population are less likely to obey a law than other segments. And the people that obey the law just can't understand why these other people just can't follow the law, right? So let me give you a perfect example. If you're looking at a low income neighborhood, a lot of those people have been incarcerated before. so it's not very stigmatizing to admit that you've been incarcerated. Whereas if you look at a group of Mount Pleasant moms that drive minivans, that is very stigmatizing, right? They don't want to be incarcerated. So you're going to see a lot less people in Mount Pleasant breaking the law, or actually getting caught. We'll talk about that later. But just in this instance, breaking the law, because going to prison is very stigmatizing for that portion of the population. Somebody that lives in low-income housing where every other person, if not more, has been incarcerated, that's not that much of a stigma to them, right? So if you're basing a policy on being incarcerated and that be a severe sanction, you're going to find certain segments of the population that are oversaturated, so that punishment is no longer stigmatizing. So it's a different stigma area. Okay, so that's often why we see this weak deterrent effect, and especially if you're trying to get an overall deterrent effect, when you've got different populations that are oversaturated, it doesn't work. When you're getting that overall effect, the average is low. So those are two of the reasons, or really three, why often we see that deterrence theory has such a weak effect. But perhaps the third reason is the one that really hits the nail on the head. So when you're testing deterrence theory, there are generally two ways to go about it. There's to test the objective properties and to test the perceptual properties. So let me explain. If you're testing the objective properties, let's just think, how would we test how effective deterrence theory is? If we're talking about the severity, we might test, our independent variable might be the number of years that you're going to be incarcerated, right? So 5 years versus 10 years, right? Which one works best? If you're testing the certainty, it might be the percentage or the arrest rate, right? If you're testing the swiftness or the celerity, it would be how many days between when you commit the crime and you get arrested, right? So those are the objective properties. Those are numbers that we can actually test, right? But so there's a lot of research on objective deterrence that shows that it has a fairly weak effect. But starting in the mid-'80s, some researchers were like, well, you know what? It may not be the objective properties that we need to be testing. Because if I asked you guys right now, who knows the punishment for aggravated assault in South Carolina? Does anybody know? That's my point. Objective research would test, 7 years, but perceptual research says it doesn't matter objectively what the punishment is. It matters what we think it is. So if we don't know what the punishment is for aggravated assault, how are we going to be deterred by that? And that's the whole point of perceptual research. It's all about what we think the certainty of getting caught of this crime, what we think the severity, the sentence that goes with it, with what we think the swiftness that will be caught, right? So it's not the objective properties. So all of this research that came out in the 80s, we're asking a group of people, like, what do you think the certainty of this crime is? What do you think the certainty or the severity or the swiftness? And they were testing it using those sort of scenarios right there. So that might be another reason why deterrence has a weak effect, because it just often comes in the form of ignorance of the law. Like, we don't know the certainty that we're going to get caught for this crime. We don't know the severity. We don't know what the punishment is, right? So a lot of this research will look, if we're looking at these perceptual properties, there's a lot of research that looks at homicide rates and compares the states that have the death penalty and states that don't have the death penalty. That would be objective, but then another way to do it would be to actually ask them, hey, do you have the death penalty in this state? Would you be more or less willing to commit a homicide because you know that? So some of the reasons that we think deterrence has a weak effect is just that people are ignorant of the law, that they just don't know. They don't know the severity, the swiftness, or the certainty of which they'll get caught. Oh, wait, okay. So let's practice our first policy implication. So let's look at this first bullet right here. Most studies have found that policies based on deterrence theory have a relatively weak effect. If you were going to recommend something based on this research, what would you recommend? let me ask you this. Would you recommend a policy based on deterrence theory? Cameron?
No.
Nope, hold on, Cameron.
I was just going to say, if policies based on deterrence theory have a relatively weak effect, then they will have a weak deterrent. I can't say it.
You're on the right track. You're just saying it real weird. Let me help you out. So basically, if we're saying that most studies that have found that policies based on deterrence theory have a very weak effect, our policy implication is simply, I do not recommend implementing policies based on deterrence theory because they have a weak effect. That's all it is, right? So if when you're going through your research, if you're finding that a study shows that a program or a policy does not reduce recidivism or isn't a deterrent, then you don't recommend it because it doesn't work, okay? So it's as simple as that. So a lot of times you can literally just take a research finding and change the order of the words to turn it into a policy implication. So this is saying, one second, Evan. This is saying programs and policies based on deterrence theory have a weak effect. Therefore, I do not recommend policies and programs based on deterrence theory. What's up, Evan?
So is that kind of how the quiz is going to work? Is it going to give us like an example and then we have to turn that into an implication?
No, I'm just going to ask you to list an implication. So literally what you could write is, I do not recommend policies based on deterrence theory. I would give you credit for that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Got it? Okay, we're going to go through the next slide with more research and we're going to practice creating some more policy implications. But like I said, usually it's just a matter of reordering the words and putting the words I recommend, or I do not recommend implementing, or I recommend implementing. What's up, Colton?
So you're saying for the purpose of the quiz, we don't even have to give a reason why, just based on what we learn, we have to say I do or do not recommend whatever policy?
Yes, but the reason why has to be based on a finding that we went over. So you can't just pull a finding out of the sky. So we're going to go over research and you need to critically be able to turn that into an implication. So if you give me an implication that is not based on a research finding that we talked about that week, you will not get credit. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. But you don't want us to go and type out like the whole reason why, so long as we have it correct.
No, exactly. I have been giving these lectures for over 10 years, so I'm well aware of the findings that we covered that week. But no, you do not have to do that. For your policy brief, you will. You'll have to give me a policy implication and then a sub-bullet telling me what research supports it. But for our quiz purposes, we're just practicing turning research into policy, okay? All right. So let's talk about sanctions. So I want to sort of continue what we were talking about with the perceptual properties of punishment. So there's been a lot of research on the perceptual properties of deterrence, so perceptions of sanctions. So what research has shown is that it's people's perception of a punishment, not the actual punishment, that plays a larger role in whether or not they decide to commit a crime. So it doesn't matter objectively what the punishment is, it's what you think the punishment is, that's going to determine whether or not you commit this crime. So the problem with this and trying to create a sanction that deters people is, first of all, they have to be aware that it exists. But the other problem is that people engage in what we refer to as belief updating, meaning what we consider to be risky behavior is dynamic. It's always changing. So let's go back and look at Stafford and Ward's explanations. So these four things, this personal experience with punishment, so on and so forth, those things are constantly creating this dynamic understanding of what we think is risky behavior, right? So, for instance, a personal experience with punishment avoidance. Say I have been speeding on 277 in Columbia for 4 years and I've never been caught, right? My certainty of getting caught is very low. If all of a sudden I get a speeding ticket, I have a personal experience with punishment, my perception of the certainty of getting caught is going to skyrocket, right? So that's what belief updating is that our beliefs of whether this behavior is risky, they're always changing based on our experiences. So Stafford and Moore showed that these 4 things are what go into that belief updating, whether or not and our perceptions are constantly changing based on our experiences, which it makes it hard for policymakers to create a punishment that's always going to deter somebody. So what research has also shown when we're talking about belief updating, your peers' experiences are actually more important than your own experiences. So those vicarious experiences, that seems to play a larger role in moving our belief updating, moving this, than our experiences. So who can explain why they think our peers' experiences are more likely to make our beliefs update than our own experiences? There's 2 really big ones that I'm looking for. Let's think about a numbers game. So you are 1 person. That's basically a sample size of 1, right? You have, 15, 20 friends. So that's comparing 1 person's experience to 15 to 20 people's experience. So for instance, if speeding on 277, right? So say none of your friends have ever gotten a speeding ticket speeding on 277, and all of a sudden you get a speeding ticket. You might just consider what happened to you a fluke, right? Whereas if you've never gotten a ticket, but 20 of your friends have gotten a ticket, you're more likely to update your belief to think that you're likely to get caught, right? So it might just have something to do with sample size. But something that someone brought up in the other classes, it might also have something to do with peer pressure, right? So you're more likely to do what your friends are doing than what you do yourself. So when we're talking about since we know that perceptions matter, and I wouldn't expect you to understand this, but as a criminologist, the way I would turn this into a policy implication would be to make sure that we hold some sort of press conference or something so that the public is aware what the punishment is, right? So have billboards or something to make the population more aware of what a punishment is and the certainty of getting caught. That's how you make a sanction deterrent, because it's less about the objective properties and more about what people think those punishments are. All right, let's talk about ways to make sanctions more deterrent. So again, we're talking about 50 years of research that I have put into 4 bullet points here for you guys. So the first one, what we know is that if you can create a sanction that triggers an informal sanction, it's going to work better. So who knows what an informal sanction is? Someone that has taken my intro class. What is an informal sanction? Stephen, what's an informal sanction? Your mic is off.
Sorry, I took your class back during knob year, but I vaguely remember it's a sanction that's not publicly made to the public, I think.
Yeah, it's basically anything that is not done by the government. So the example you gave earlier about being spanked, that's an informal sanction. So a formal sanction means it comes from the government. An informal sanction is literally anything else. So what sort of sanction that the government gives might trigger an informal sanction? Who can give me an example? Colton?
If you're a registered sex offender, you have to go around and introduce yourself as such.
Yes. And what sort of informal sanctions might that trigger?
Oh my God, everyone's going to hate me because I touch children, so I'm not going to do that.
Yes, and just for the record, there's other ways to be a sex offender besides pedophilia, but I see what you're saying, right? So if that right there being on a sex offender registry list or community notification where you literally have to put like a sign in your yard or introduce yourself to neighbors, that is a perfect example of a sanction that will trigger informal sanctions. So an example that I like to give that happened to me when I was getting my PhD at FSU, I was also running the internship program and teaching. So I was also an employee of FSU. And they passed a policy and they sent this email out to everybody. And they're like, oh, hey, by the way, so if you're receiving this email, you work for FSU, and we just passed a policy that said that if you get arrested, you have 24 hours to report it to us. And oh, by the way, we're also going to fire you. So that right there, being fired from my job, that is an informal sanction. So all of a sudden, all illegal activities that I could possibly get caught for would trigger an informal sanction of me being fired from my job. So if you can create a sanction that will trigger informal sanctions, it's more likely to be deterrent, because you're actually going to lose twice in this instance, or multiple times, right? So if you get fired from your job and you have a mortgage and a car payment and children and a wife to support or a husband to support, those are like 5 informal sanctions that have been triggered because of that. So if you're going to use deterrence theory, if you can create a sanction that will then trigger informal sanctions, that works best. So the next way to make a sanction actually deter is you got to make sure that it's seen as credible and fair. So let's break those two down. So credible means it can actually be enforceable. So let's talk about the mask ordinance that they have passed in Charleston County. So how enforceable is that policy? Like, what is the likelihood that you're going to get a ticket if you walk outside of campus gates without a mask on?
Not very enforceable.
Right. They just don't have the manpower to enforce it. So that right there, that's not a credible threat. They tried to make it more credible by, well, actually, all they did in this instance recently is they increased the severity. So they used to give you a warning, right? But they actually weren't like writing down who got warnings. So that was a super non-credible threat right there, is that literally every time you get caught, unless it's the same officer that catches you, probably within the same day, they don't have any way of knowing that you were caught before. But recently they passed it that said the first offense is like $100. So that made it slightly more credible, right? But it's still, they just don't have the manpower to do it. So it's not a very credible threat. The next one is that it has to be fair, because if it's not fair, you might face problems like jury nullification. So who knows what jury nullification is? Stephen?
It's when the jury does not come to an agreement with the punishment and they just disregard and vote not guilty.
You're right at the end. There was a bit of confusing language in the beginning, but jury nullification means that the prosecutor has proved his case or her case, and the jury still votes not guilty simply because they disagree with the punishment. So I could go on a rant about the death penalty here on bifurcated trials, but I'll save you all of that. But basically, if the sanction is not seen as fair, you might find that the cops don't want to arrest you for it. The prosecutors won't press charges, or worse, if it makes it all the way up to that phase, the jury won't convict because they don't agree with the punishment. So the other thing that we have found, so we know that deterrence theory is based on certain, swift, proportionately severe, right? So there's all kinds of research that looks at each of those 3 properties. What they have found is that if you focus on the certainty of getting caught as opposed to the severity or the swiftness, that's where you're going to find the biggest effect. So who can think of a policy that increases the certainty of getting caught? There's been a recent one.
Facial recognition software.
Yeah, that's a good one right there, right? So there's facial recognition. The one that I usually get are the red light cameras, right? So the likelihood of getting caught running a red light used to rely on a cop happened to be sitting there. Now with a red light camera, I mean, the certainty of getting caught is almost 100%. So that right there is a program or a policy that will increase the certainty. So if you can increase the certainty that people will get caught for their crimes, the sanction is going to have a more deterrent effect. So the last one that we want to go through is that sanctions and policies that are not based on rational choice theory are the most effective at reducing recidivism. So who knows what rational choice theory is? Who's taking criminology? Rational choice theory. Basically, this is the theory that says that you're doing a cost-benefit analysis before you commit a crime. So generally, rational choice says if you up the severity, then you're gonna reduce the number of people that commit crimes. But we already know that upping the severity doesn't work, mainly because of the perceptual properties of punishment. So just because you up the perception or because you up the punishment, that doesn't necessarily mean that people know that. And also people usually have a threshold. So if we say that we are upping a fine from $100 to $200, that difference doesn't usually make much of a difference in people's minds. That's not going to make twice the number of people be less likely to commit the crime. Or same is if you go from a 5-year sentence to a 10-year sentence. Most people just don't want jail time at all. So upping the punishment, the severity of the punishment, it doesn't really have that much of an effect. All right, so these four, basically, I want one person to volunteer to turn each of these into policy implications, and then we are done with class. So if we all sit here and stare at each other, we're going to be here forever. Okay, so who wants to turn this first one? Sanctions that trigger informal sanctions are the most deterrent. Colton?
I recommend policies that rely on sanctions which trigger informal sanctions.
Very good. The only wording I would change is you recommend implementing policies that will trigger informal sanctions. Perfect. Okay, sanctions have to be seen as credible and fair. Who can turn that into? All right, Thomas.
I would recommend policies that are perceived by the public to be right, they would think are fair.
Perfect. And just make sure you use the word credible. Is that what you meant by right? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what about largest deterrent effect for certainty? Who can do that one? All right, Stephen.
All right, I recommend that you pass a sanction a policy that would cause a large percent for people getting caught to occur.
I see what you're saying. You don't really need to reinvent the wheel here. You can use the same words. So start over. You recommend a policy that does what?
That causes the largest deterrent effect to occur.
No. Well, I mean, we always want that. But what we're looking for here is you want to implement a policy that increases the certainty of getting caught. That's the important part right there, but close. All right, who can do the last one? Somebody needs to do the last one and then we're done. No, Stephen, you just did one. It's got to be someone else.
Dr. Hill?
Yes.
Could you, so it's saying that sanctions and policies not based on rational choice. Could you say, I do not recommend sanctions in policies based off of rational choice theory?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's as simple as that. If something says it does not work to reduce recidivism, then you recommend not implementing a policy based on that. If something does work, then you say, I recommend that you implement this policy. So what you might find moving forward as you start doing your research for your policy briefs is that like a policy or a program might work for adults only and not juveniles. So you might say, I recommend implementing this for adults only, or this only works on females. I recommend implementing this for females. So basically you just kind of want to reorder the word and throw the words I recommend implementing or not implementing at the top or at the beginning of the sentence. It's almost as simple as that. So those 4 that we just went through, any of those can be the answer to question number 5 on the quiz. Or if you wanted to do that we shouldn't be basing our policies on deterrence theory, that works as well. Questions? All right, so just a few things before I let you go. Let's see, so you guys now have 24 hours to take your quiz. So starting at 10:45 today, you can take it starting between 10:45, so in about 30 minutes until 10:45 in the morning tomorrow, okay? However, Danielle, I see you there. James, I see you. And Cameron, there you are. You 3 do not take the quiz today, and on Tuesday morning, you're gonna take it live, and you already know what the 5th question is going to be. So it's gonna be a question of who can pop their mic, or who can say it fast enough, really. Okay, any questions before we go? All right, so I have officially updated Canvas to make those, the quizzes open for 24 hours. It took me forever to do because I had written that they were available for 12 hours in like 70 different places. So I had to go through and make all those changes. I've also changed the syllabus, and today on my to-do list, I'm gonna upload an assignment in the pages area. Also in assignments for the extra credit. So right now it's Always Sunny in Philadelphia extra credit that I mentioned, and I'm also going to allow a second extra credit opportunity. There is a conference, a virtual conference in October. I think it's the last week in October, and registration is free. So if you register for that conference and attend at least 1 panel, basically all you're doing is, I think it's gonna be through Zoom, I don't know yet, but it's virtual. You just need to listen to 1 panel. You can listen to as many as you want. I'll also give you extra credit for that. So what I'm thinking, since usually what I do is I offer a jail tour too, but we can't do that this semester for obvious reasons. So you can do both of those extra credit opportunities if you want. And they will replace your 2 lowest quiz grades with a 5 out of 5. So I'm gonna upload a document with all of that information. I need to figure out how, I think maybe what I'll do is for the virtual conference, I'll make you take like a screenshot that you're like listening to the panel or something like that. I gotta figure that out to prove that you actually did it. But I'm gonna upload that today. I'll send an email to everybody letting them know that I have changed the number of hours that you have for the quiz, and also that the extra credit opportunities are available. Any questions for me? All right, well, I'll see you guys on Tuesday. If you have technological problems with the quiz, just shoot me an email, okay? See you on Tuesday.